Jake Carter was a kid who didn't belong, and he knew it. His clothes were worn and faded, a constant reminder of his family's struggles. At Ridgewood High, his social standing was as low as it could get. He was the quiet kid, always overlooked, always the last one picked for teams. The popular kids had their perfect clothes, expensive gadgets, and cars. Jake had none of that, and it made him a target for their ridicule. Every day felt like a test of endurance, subtle taunts, mockery of his lunch, or jokes about his worn sneakers. In gym class, the teasing escalated. The more competitive students used physical activity as a means to assert dominance. Jake's lack of skill was never overlooked. In a setting where ability was put on display, he was always on the receiving end of comments that reinforced his position. "You can't even keep up," one of the jocks would say, chuckling after Jake fumbled with a ball or failed to make a pass. It wasn't just the obvious taunts, but the ongoing way they made it clear he wasn't good enough to be part of the team, even in the most casual games. The more he tried to avoid confrontation, the more they seemed to take pleasure in pointing out his weaknesses. Chad, the leader of the popular group, had a special way of delivering these jabs. His insults were never just about Jake's physical abilities, but were aimed at undermining his very presence in the space. "You don't belong here," he would say in a tone laced with condescension. "Go back to the bleachers, loser." It wasn't a challenge. It was an order, an indication that Jake wasn't even worth being acknowledged as part of the group. It wasn't about sport. It was about power. Outside of gym, it was the same. In group discussions or social gatherings, Jake's opinions and contributions went unnoticed or were dismissed. If he did speak, it was often met with silence or a quick change of subject. His ideas weren't worth engaging with. His voice wasn't worth listening to. It wasn't about disagreement. It was about making sure Jake knew he was invisible. Even when he wasn't being directly targeted, the exclusion felt as harsh as any words thrown his way. Jake learned not to react. He absorbed the mockery in silence, each remark cutting a little deeper, but he didn't give them the satisfaction of a response. They wanted him to fight back, to show weakness, so they could escalate the cruelty. But Jake understood the game. He learned that silence could be just as powerful, a shield that prevented them from gaining the reaction they craved. Instead, he buried his feelings, hoping the days would pass quickly, hoping he could outlast the barrage. But as time wore on, the constant mockery became a steady hum in the background of his school life, something he couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried. Jake's passion for boxing wasn't something anyone knew about. While his peers were focused on their social lives, he had quietly discovered a way to build strength in a space where he could be alone. The source of this passion came from a series of online tutorials. On a website that offered free lessons, Jake learned boxing techniques. The basics came first: footwork, jabs, and hooks. Slowly, he began to understand the discipline required to master the sport. With each video, his technique improved, and what started as curiosity turned into a quiet commitment. Jake didn't have access to a proper gym or the high-end equipment his classmates likely used for their sports, but he made do. His training equipment consisted of a set of old boxing gloves and a punching bag that his mum had bought from a garage sale. It wasn't the best, but it was all he had, and it was enough. With limited resources, Jake used his creativity to maximize the training he could do in the small space of his basement. The bag, despite its wear and tear, became his constant companion, always there when he needed it. The process was solitary. Jake wasn't trying to impress anyone or show off his skills. Each punch, each combination of strikes, wasn't about proving himself to others. It was a means of control. The repetition of punches, the steady rhythm of his movements, became his way of creating order in a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable. Boxing gave him a sense of purpose, a way to focus his energy on something tangible. It was not about escaping his reality, but transforming it. As the punches landed, Jake felt in control, something he rarely felt in the rest of his life. What made boxing special for Jake wasn't just the physical exertion, it was the mental clarity that came with it. The world outside, full of mockery and judgment, seemed to fade away. With every jab and uppercut, Jake developed a deeper sense of discipline. The challenges he faced at school, the cruel jokes, the exclusion, they became distant as his focus shifted entirely to his training. Boxing wasn't a hobby for Jake, it was his anchor. This practice wasn't just a casual pastime. Over the months, it became a routine that strengthened both his body and mind. Jake didn't tell anyone about his training. It was his private world, a sanctuary where he didn't need to justify his actions to anyone. The more he practiced, the more confident he became in his abilities, not just as a boxer, but as a person who could take control of his life in ways that others couldn't see. Jake's boxing was an investment in his future, even though no one knew it yet. Every punch was a step towards something greater, a silent rebellion against the labels others had assigned him. What they saw as weakness, Jake was quietly transforming into strength. Jake's growth took a significant turn when he found guidance from an unexpected source. Coach Richards, the school's gym teacher, had always been a background figure in Jake's life, just another authority figure in a sea of others who saw him as an afterthought. However, when Coach Richards noticed Jake practicing his punches, after school he saw something different. It wasn't just the form of his punches that caught Coach's attention. It was the raw potential, the unrefined skill that could be shaped into something greater. Rather than dismiss Jake as another kid with no prospects, Coach Richards saw an opportunity. He recognized that Jake's commitment to boxing wasn't a passing interest, but a genuine passion. Rather than chastising him for practicing alone, he offered to help him refine his skills. This wasn't just about boxing technique. It was about building a foundation of discipline, focus, and self-control. Coach Richards became a mentor, a figure who provided structure to Jake's efforts and helped him channel his energy into something purposeful. The lessons Jake learned weren't just about fighting. Coach taught him how to direct his anger and frustration into controlled actions. The discipline Jake developed in the gym mirrored his growing ability to control his impulses in the outside world. Where he had once been passive and reactive to the world's harshness, he began to develop a quiet resilience. The more he trained, the more confident he became in his abilities. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was steady. With each training session, Jake's strength grew, not just physically, but mentally. His previous uncertainty began to fade. The things that had once intimidated him, the mockery, the judgment, the exclusion, no longer seemed so powerful. He had learned how to carry himself with a new sense of purpose. The quiet, invisible boy that others had ignored now stood taller, more grounded, and more aware of his own worth. Through boxing, Jake found a structure that allowed him to grow, both as an athlete and as an individual. This period of growth was more than just about improving his fighting skills. It was about refining the internal processes that governed how Jake navigated the world. He wasn't merely learning how to throw punches, he was learning how to defend himself, not just physically, but emotionally. He understood that control wasn't just about force, it was about restraint. Through this training, Jake gained a sense of autonomy that he had never experienced before. No longer did he feel powerless in the face of others' judgment. With each lesson, he became more self-assured, and his physical transformation was a reflection of the mental shifts taking place inside him. Jake's internal growth became apparent to those around him, though they couldn't pinpoint the exact change. He wasn't brash or confrontational, but there was a quiet certainty in the way he moved through his day. He no longer let the mockery of others define him. The foundation that Coach Richards had helped him build wasn't just about boxing. It was about the discipline of taking ownership of his life. Jake was evolving into someone no longer willing to be ignored. He was no longer the boy defined by his poverty, nor the silent victim of others' cruelty. Instead, he was becoming a presence that demanded respect, even without a single word spoken. His journey wasn't just about boxing. It was about discovering and honing his own strength, something no one could take away from him. The culmination of Jake's journey arrived when the bullying reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. It wasn't a single comment or a one-off incident, but a culmination of years of mockery and exclusion. Jake had endured insults, jokes, and taunts about his clothes, his abilities, and his family's financial struggles. For a long time he had remained silent, absorbing everything without retaliation. But the escalation came during the school's annual charity fundraiser, an event meant to showcase the talents of the students. As part of the event, students were encouraged to perform or showcase some skill. It wasn't just a light-hearted competition, it was an opportunity for the student body to put their abilities on display. Jake, as expected, was mocked by the popular group who questioned what talent he had to offer. Their remarks were typical, pointing out his lack of anything noteworthy to present. Chad, the unofficial leader of the group, took it a step further. He targeted Jake in front of everyone, daring him to do something, anything, to prove his worth. "What's it going to be, Carter? You gonna dance?" "Maybe you'll box me, loser," he said, his voice full of mockery. The words hit Jake differently this time. It wasn't just another round of insults. It was a challenge, an opportunity to stand up and show he wasn't the target anymore. The weight of all the years of ridicule hung heavy on him, but it sparked something in him that he hadn't fully recognized before, the desire to not let it continue, to not be seen as weak. Jake didn't shout back or retaliate with insults. Instead, he walked to the center of the gym, quiet and composed. He grabbed the microphone not to argue but to issue a challenge. He didn't say much, but what he did say was enough. The room fell silent as Jake simply stated that he would face Chad in a match. It wasn't about proving strength, it was about showing that he wouldn't be intimidated anymore. There was no need for anger, no need to yell. Jake had found a new strength in control, in standing his ground with purpose. The challenge wasn't something everyone understood immediately. Most of the students were taken aback, surprised by Jake's calm demeanor and decision to confront the bully without raising his voice. But it was exactly this calmness that signaled his growth. It wasn't the physicality of the match that mattered, nor the outcome. What was significant was the way Jake took control of the situation. He wasn't the victim anymore. He had evolved from the silent kid in the corner to someone who could face down his bullies with composure, strength, and focus. The match itself wasn't about physical victory. It was about Jake's willingness to face his tormentor head-on. He didn't have the same skill or strength that Chad did, but he didn't need to win in the traditional sense. By standing his ground and facing Chad, Jake proved something far more important. He had claimed his own sense of power, his right to exist in the space without being diminished. His quiet resolve was far more impactful than any physical victory could have been. When the match ended, Jake wasn't celebrated for his strength or fighting ability. The applause wasn't for his physical prowess, but for the courage he displayed in stepping up and taking control of the narrative. It was a silent victory, not of domination, but of self-assertion. He had stood up not only to Chad, but to the years of mockery that had defined him. In that moment, Jake Carter was no longer the invisible kid in the back of the room. He was someone who had earned his place. Jake's victory was not one marked by external accolades or recognition. It wasn't about the applause or validation from his peers. The real triumph lay in his internal transformation. He had faced the mockery and isolation with resilience, and through that, he had built something far more lasting, a quiet confidence in his own worth. The constant need to seek approval from others dissipated. He had reached a point where the opinions of those who once dismissed him no longer had the same power. The taunts and jokes from his classmates continued, but they no longer carried the same weight. Where they had once stung, now they were nothing more than background noise. Jake had discovered that true strength wasn't in silencing the world, but in not letting it define him. He no longer sought external validation. He had come to understand that his value wasn't dependent on the approval of others. The journey that had once been about survival was now about self-respect. His victory wasn't dramatic, nor was it something anyone could point to and say, "That's where Jake changed." It was a subtle shift, a transformation that had occurred over time. With each moment of practice, each lesson learned from his mentor, and each challenge he faced, Jake had built a new sense of self. The victory was not in defeating someone else, but in defeating the limitations he had once placed on himself. This new perspective allowed Jake to walk through his days with a sense of purpose that was unshakable. No longer concerned with winning the approval of others, he carried himself with a quiet assurance. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. His peace came from within, not from external recognition. The journey had been long and difficult, but it was his own. In the end, Jake realized that the true victory was not in the applause, but in the quiet certainty of knowing who he had become. Months after the turning point, Jake's presence at Ridgewood High had undergone a significant transformation. He no longer sought approval, nor did he feel the need to fit into any particular group. The dynamics of high school remained the same: the popular students, the whispers, the subtle judgments. However, Jake was no longer a part of that equation. The shift in him had altered how others perceived him, even without any visible change in his behavior. His reputation had evolved not from any display of power or confrontation, but from an internal shift that resonated outward. Jake had stopped trying to be noticed or to fight for respect. His walk through the halls no longer reflected the uncertainty that had once defined him. He moved with purpose, no longer trying to hide, but simply being. His posture was different, grounded, and unbothered by the occasional side glances or quiet murmurs. Where once those moments would have consumed him, they now held little sway. His quiet confidence was enough to stand on its own. The people who had once targeted him no longer saw him as vulnerable. The mockery had softened. While the jokes never truly stopped, they lacked the sharp edge they once carried. His transformation was not because of any outward gesture, but from the subtle way he carried himself. In the face of their judgment, Jake no longer reacted with the defensiveness of his earlier years. He was not interested in their opinions, nor was he seeking to change them. One encounter highlighted this change most clearly. As he walked through the hallways, Jake crossed paths with Chad, the source of much of his earlier ridicule. Chad's presence had once been a trigger, a reminder of the bullying Jake had endured. Now, as their eyes met, there was no confrontation, no need for words or gestures. What had once been a scene of mockery now held nothing. Jake simply looked at Chad and continued walking. In that exchange, there was no need for Jake to prove anything. His silence, his confidence had spoken for him. The world around Jake hadn't changed dramatically. The high school hierarchy remained, but Jake's relationship with it had shifted. He no longer needed to participate in the drama of social status. His growth had allowed him to rise above it. His quiet strength was not defined by how others treated him, but by his internal resolve. Jake understood that the world's perception of him was no longer his concern. He had created a new definition of himself, one that wasn't tied to his past, nor to the opinions of those who didn't matter. The whispers and glances were still there, but they had lost their power. Jake no longer needed to react to them. His silence was now a form of strength. His presence was a quiet reminder to himself and others that confidence comes from within, and that sometimes the best way to handle the world is not by fighting back, but by being unapologetically yourself.